Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm excited to show you my latest project, a custom epoxy desk. This one's extra special because I'm encapsulating a beautiful piece of artwork in the resin. Let's dive into the process. I've spent a lot of time creating the artwork I'm going to be encapsulating. The goal is to preserve it in crystal clear epoxy, turning it into a functional and stunning work of art. The first step is building the mold. This part is critical to ensure the resin stays contained and creates clean edges. I'm using melamine boards for the mold, as they're great for preventing the resin from sticking. After cutting the pieces to size, I assemble the mold carefully, securing all the edges with screws and sealing every seam with silicone. This prevents any resin from leaking out during the pour, because trust me, no one wants to deal with that kind of mess. Before pouring the resin, I make sure the mold is perfectly level. Using a leveling tool, I adjust the mold with shims until the bubble is centered, checking from all angles. This step ensures the resin spreads evenly and cures into a smooth, flat surface, absolutely essential for a flawless result. Once the mold is ready, I apply a mold release agent to all the surfaces. This step is crucial for making sure the epoxy doesn't stick to the mold when it's time to demold the piece. A quick, even application goes a long way in ensuring a clean release later on. Next, I carefully place the artwork inside the mold, making sure it's perfectly centered. This part requires precision because once the resin is poured, there's no going back. To make sure everything is aligned, I measure all the edges from the artwork to the mold walls. I place heavy weights on top to keep it secure and prevent any movement during the pour. Then, I measure all the gaps between the artwork and the edges of the mold. This helps me calculate the exact amount of resin needed to fill the mold without wasting any material. I sum up the measurements and divide by the total number of measurements to get an average. Then, I simply plug everything into an online resin calculator, which quickly gives me the exact amount of resin needed for the pour. It's an easy and accurate way to avoid wasting materials or running short. I'm using a two-part epoxy resin which requires precise measurements to ensure it cures properly. I start by carefully measuring the resin and hardener according to the manufacturer's instructions. It's really important to get these proportions exact, as even a small imbalance can cause curing issues. Once the resin and hardener are measured, I mix them together thoroughly. I make sure to scrape the sides and bottom of the container as I mix, so nothing is left unmixed. You'll know it's ready when the resin is completely clear and free of streaks. This is a deep pour epoxy, which takes about 4 days to fully cure. Because I'm using mica powder for the sides, I have to do this in 2 separate pours. First, I pour the resin along the edges, making sure to get an even and smooth application. Once the edges are done, I focus on sealing the top part of the artwork. This is crucial to prevent any bubbles from escaping the wood and ruining the finish. 3 days later, after the resin had fully cured, I returned to continue the project. I started by carefully removing the weights that had kept everything secure during the curing process. As I peeled off the cloths, I noticed that some resin had seeped into them and, unfortunately, it had torn off a small piece of my artwork. Using black paint, I carefully restored the affected area, blending it seamlessly back into the design. I'm preparing everything to seal the top of the artwork with a fast-curing epoxy. This particular epoxy becomes touch dry in about half an hour, but I'll let it sit for a few hours to ensure it's fully set before moving on to the final pour. In the meantime, I'll shift my focus to working on the right leg of the desk to keep the project moving smoothly. I need the leg to match the width and depth of the table for a seamless look. To achieve this, I'm using 2 15mm thick plywood panels, which I'll glue together to create a strong and durable base. Since the table will be quite heavy, around 30 kilograms or 66 pounds. It's crucial that the leg is sturdy enough to support the weight without bending or warping over time. I will tightly secure the bond using clamps and screws to ensure maximum strength and durability. This entire project took about 4 weeks to complete. I was juggling multiple projects at the same time, which made it challenging to keep track of everything I was working on. It required a lot of focus and organization, but seeing the final result made it all worth it. Once I finished assembling the leg, I let everything dry for about a day to ensure the glue set properly. I'm building a new mold specifically for the leg. The goal for the leg is to seamlessly match the table base, creating a cohesive design. I want to give it a waterfall effect, a flowing pattern that cascades down the side, just like a stream suddenly dropping off a ledge. I needed to make some space in the resin room, so I took down my main artwork and cleared the area to get everything ready for the final pour. Once I had enough room, I got to work mixing the resin again. This project has been a constant cycle of pouring and sanding. To mix the resin, I start by measuring equal parts of resin and hardener. Once measured, I pour them into a mixing container and stir thoroughly for about 3 to 5 minutes. As the resin has a slow curing process, I don't really care about bubbles. I make sure to scrape the sides and bottom of the container to ensure everything is fully combined. Once the mixture is clear and free of streaks, it's ready to pour. Now let's focus on the leg. I brought the mold into the epoxy room to start the next steps. First, I carefully placed the plywood inside the mold, making sure everything was perfectly aligned. I measured multiple times to ensure the piece was centered. I added plaster to fill all the screw holes from assembling the plywood. This step not only cleans up the appearance but also prevents resin from seeping into those gaps during the pour. With that done, I moved on to sealing the wood with a fast-curing resin. Sealing is an essential step whenever you're working with wood and resin. Wood is a porous material, which means it can trap air. If left unsealed, that air can escape during the main pour, creating bubbles in the resin and potentially ruining the smooth finish. The seal coat essentially locks the wood's surface, preventing any air from escaping and ensuring the resin bonds properly. Now I'm obviously back to mixing resin again. At this point, it feels like mixing resin has become second nature with this project. As always, I carefully measure the resin and hardener to ensure the correct ratio. Let's just play some music for a minute so I can stop bothering you with all that talk. I'm now cutting all 4 edges of the main piece using my saw. As you can see, working with resin creates an incredible amount of dust. It gets everywhere. You end up spending just as much time cleaning the room as you do working on the project. Once the cuts were finished, I checked the angles to ensure they were exactly 90 degrees, which is crucial for a clean, professional look. Next, I moved on to the sanding process. A key tip here is to clean the piece thoroughly between sanding stages to remove any dust and prevent it from affecting the next grit. After completing the sanding, I cleaned everything up and grabbed my router to create a chamfer along the edges. When using the router, it's important to make multiple light passes. Going too hard on the resin can cause it to crack or even break off chunks, which would be a nightmare. You'd have to start over and fix it with larger tools. After finishing the chamfer, I sanded everything again to ensure a perfectly smooth surface. Now this is where things got interesting, and not in a good way. As I was inspecting the main piece, I realized that the resin wasn't evenly spread. One end had more resin than the other, and the imbalance was noticeable. To fix this, I decided to create a guide for my router so I could level the surface perfectly. The idea seemed great at first, but things quickly took a turn. As I worked, I ended up drilling much deeper than I intended. Going way past the surface, I needed to adjust. It was a complete disaster, and I knew I had made things worse. I'll be pouring another layer of epoxy later, but let's just play some music again. 2 days after the top pour, it's time to tackle the resin excess and flatten everything down for a perfectly smooth finish. For this, I'm using my belt sander, starting with a 40 grit sandpaper. This grit is pretty aggressive and does a great job of quickly removing material. Once that's done, I'll gradually work my way up, moving to 80 grit, then 120, and continuing all the way to 320 grit. This progression ensures the surface becomes progressively smoother with each step. I'm taking the desk to my friend Armand's shop for the next steps. The table is incredibly heavy, and being on the 4th floor made it quite the challenge to get it down. It took a lot of effort, but I managed to carefully move it without any disasters. Once I got to Armand's shop, I started by painting the backside of the desk black. This step might seem small, but it gives the piece a clean and polished finish. After that, I moved on to the varnishing process. I took the desk into the spray cabin to apply the varnish, ensuring an even and professional coat to protect and enhance the resin surface. This final step really brings the whole piece together. Here is the final result. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.